Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. The night has fallen, the world outside is quiet, and the air feels still. This is the time when everything slows down, when your thoughts begin to drift, and the shadows in the corners of your room seem just a little darker than before. You're safe, of course. You're alone. But have you ever had that feeling? The sense that someone or something might be watching, hidden just out of sight, just beyond the walls. Tonight's story is about a man who thought he was alone until he realized something was watching him, something that had always been there, waiting. Get comfortable, let your mind settle, and listen closely. This is The Eyes Watching from Within the Walls. I should have known something was wrong the moment I signed the lease. The landlord, an older man with graying hair and a permanently nervous expression, barely looked me in the eye as he handed me the keys. The place was cheap, too cheap for a city like Detroit, but I had convinced myself it was just luck, that I had stumbled upon a hidden gem in a city full of overpriced, cramped apartments. The building itself was ancient, the kind of place that looked like it had lived through 100 miserable winters and had barely survived each one. The bricks were cracked, and the paint on the doorframe peeled like dead skin. The hallway leading to my unit smelled of something old. Dust, mold, and maybe something else. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, Unit 3B. The hallway light outside my door flickered erratically, buzzing like an insect trapped in glass. I twisted the key in the lock, and the door creaked open to reveal a small studio apartment with wooden floors that groaned under my weight. The air inside was stale, as if no one had lived there in years. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that crawled up my spine. It was just an old apartment, nothing more. The first thing I did was set down my duffel bag on the floor next to the bed. A simple mattress on a metal frame. The room was sparsely furnished. A wooden desk with a single chair, a rickety wardrobe, and a floor lamp in the corner that flickered weakly when I turned it on. I sighed and ran a hand through my hair. Not bad, I muttered to myself, forcing optimism into my voice. Could be worse. I spent the next hour unpacking, placing my clothes in the wardrobe and arranging my few belongings around the room. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a nagging sensation in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. First, I thought it was just the quiet. The building was eerily silent, even though I knew there were other tenants. I'd passed by a few doors with muffled sounds of TVs or distant conversations. My floor seemed dead. There were no footsteps, no creaking from above or below, nothing to indicate I had neighbors at all. I walked over to the only window in the room and pushed it open, letting in the cool evening air. From here, I had a view of the alleyway behind the building, where a single street lamp cast a dim, yellow glow over the cracked pavement. There was movement near the dumpster, probably a stray cat or a rat. The city never really slept, but up here, in this tiny apartment, it felt like I had stepped into a bubble of stillness. Shrugging off the unease, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. The bathroom was small, with white tiles that had turned a dull gray over time. The sink faucet dripped constantly, the sound echoing in the confined space. As I stood under the lukewarm water, I tried to push away the strange feeling settling in my gut. Maybe it was just nerves. A new place, a new city. I wasn't used to living alone. After the shower, I threw on a t-shirt and some sweatpants before collapsing onto the mattress. The bed was firm, but I was exhausted enough that I didn't care. I reached over to turn off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. That was when I felt it, a sensation, a weightless, invisible thing pressing against me, the feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes and scanned the dark room. Nothing, just the faint outline of furniture and the weak glow of the city lights filtering through the window. I swallowed, telling myself I was being paranoid. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me as I lay there, my eyes wide open, my breath shallow. Every instinct in my body screamed that there was something in the room with me, something just beyond my line of sight. I forced myself to roll over, squeezing my eyes shut. Sleep. I just needed sleep. My mind was playing tricks on me, but even as I drifted into unconsciousness, the feeling remained. And somewhere, in the stillness of the night, I swore I heard something shift against the wall. The feeling of being watched never truly went away. It lingered, like a cold breath against the back of my neck, just subtle enough to make me question whether it was real or just my paranoia playing tricks on me. That first night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the sensation of unseen eyes pressed against me, keeping me awake. When I finally did manage to drift off, my sleep was restless, plagued with strange, indistinct dreams, flashes of darkness, the sound of something whispering just out of earshot, the feeling of being submerged in something thick and suffocating. I woke up groggy, my mouth dry and my body aching. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting weak, pale light across the room. I groaned as I sat up, rubbing my face, trying to shake off the unease that had settled deep into my bones. It was just my imagination, I told myself, just a combination of exhaustion, moving stress, and the eeriness of being alone in a new place. But even in the morning light, the feeling remained. I moved through my morning routine on autopilot, brushing my teeth, throwing on some clothes, grabbing my phone. As I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, I hesitated. For just a second, I thought I saw movement behind me in the reflection, a flicker of something near the wall. I spun around so fast that my elbow knocked into the sink, sending a sharp jolt of pain up my arm. Nothing, just my empty apartment. I let out a shaky breath and ran a hand through my hair, laughing nervously at myself. "Jesus, Jake, get a grip," I muttered, shaking my head. By the time I stepped out of my apartment to grab coffee from the shop down the street, I had almost convinced myself that everything was fine. Almost. When I returned, the hallway outside my door felt colder than before, like a draft was seeping through the walls. I frowned, glancing toward the ceiling, half expecting to see a vent or a crack letting in air. But the hallway was just as it had been before. Dimly lit, slightly claustrophobic, silent. As I unlocked my door and stepped inside, I hesitated. Something felt different. I stood there, just inside my apartment, scanning the room. My coffee cup felt too warm in my hands, my grip tightening around it. Took me a moment to realize what was wrong. The air. It smelled different. Before, the apartment had that old, musty scent, like dust and wood that had been sitting untouched for years. But now, beneath that, there was something else. Something faint. A smell like damp fabric. Like breath. The kind of smell you notice when someone has been standing too close for too long. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move, to shake off the ridiculous thought that someone had been in my apartment while I was gone. That was insane. Still, as I walked toward my desk and set my coffee down, I couldn't help but glance toward the walls. The sensation of being watched crawled back over me, wrapping around my shoulders like an unseen weight. I shook my head. Maybe I just needed to get out more, spend less time cooped up in this place, letting my imagination run wild. I sat at my desk, opening my laptop, deciding to distract myself with work. But as I stared at the screen, typing absent-mindedly, I felt it again. That strange, prickling awareness. Like eyes, like something just behind me. I turned my head slightly, just enough to glance at the wall to my left. The wall was cracked and slightly discolored in places, like water damage had settled in long ago and no one had bothered to fix it. But there was nothing unusual about it. Still, I squinted, leaning closer. One of the cracks, just above eye level, was darker than the others. A thin, jagged line that stood out against the pale paint. My breath caught in my throat. It almost looked like a slit, like an eyelid half closed. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "You're losing it," I muttered under my breath. I forced myself to look away, to focus on my laptop screen. But I couldn't shake the feeling that, even when I wasn't looking, something on that wall was looking at me. I stood up suddenly, pushing my chair back with more force than necessary. The scraping sound echoed through the empty room. I just needed air, maybe some food. Grabbing my jacket, I decided to go for a walk. But as I turned toward the door, something made me stop. A sound, faint, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the wall. A shift, a movement, like something settling into place. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, my breath locked in my throat. And then, slowly, deliberately, I turned back to look at the wall. The crack was still there, just as dark, just as jagged. But now I was sure. It was slightly wider than before, as if something had moved behind it. Watching, I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, as I stared at the thin crack in the wall. The room felt unnaturally still, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe the crack had always been like that. Maybe I had never really paid close attention to it before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It had moved. Something behind the wall had shifted. I forced myself to look away, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. My body was tense, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But leave and go where? This was my apartment. I had just moved in. I wasn't about to let some stupid paranoia get the best of me. Swallowing the fear creeping up my spine, I took a shaky breath and walked toward the crack. My heart pounded with each step. The closer I got, the more I felt that strange sensation, like an invisible pressure against my skin, like something was aware of me approaching. When I was finally close enough, I hesitated. From this angle, the crack was no longer just a dark line on the wall. It had depth, a thin slit like the tiniest opening into something beyond the surface of the room. I felt my stomach twist. A rational part of my mind told me that it was just a structural issue. The building was old, after all. Maybe there was some kind of void behind the walls. Maybe the foundation was shifting, causing small openings to appear. That would explain the movement, right? But another part of me, one that I didn't want to listen to, whispered that this was something else, something unnatural. My fingers twitched at my sides. I didn't want to, but I had to know. With slow, deliberate movements, I reached out and touched the crack. The moment my fingertips met the surface, a chill shot up my arm, so cold it almost burned. I gasped and pulled my hand back, shaking it as if I had touched ice. The temperature in the apartment hadn't changed, but that spot on the wall, it felt wrong. I stepped back, rubbing my hand, debating what to do next. My mind screamed at me to leave it alone, to just forget about it and go on with my night. But curiosity, that damn human instinct, kept gnawing at me. Taking a deep breath, I walked to my desk, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The weak glow illuminated the crack, casting sharp shadows along the jagged edges. Slowly, I moved the light closer, angling it slightly, and that's when I saw it. Something inside the crack moved. I jerked backward, nearly dropping my phone. My chest tightened as my breath hitched in my throat. Couldn't have just seen that. It had to be a trick of the light, a shadow playing games with my already fragile nerves. But then, before I could even fully process what was happening, it blinked. A single, glistening eyeball shifted behind the crack, adjusting, staring directly at me. I let out a choked gasp and stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The phone's light flickered slightly as my hands trembled. The eye didn't move away. It stayed there, unblinking, wide, the pupil dilating slightly as it followed my every movement. For a moment, neither of us moved. I was too horrified to react. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it was a prank, a hidden camera, some kind of weird optical illusion. But none of those made sense, because the eye was real. It was wet, glistening under the glow of my flashlight. I could see the thin red veins running through the whites of it, the subtle twitch of the iris as it adjusted to the light. It was human, and it was watching me. I had to get out of there. Now, I turned on my heel, sprinting toward the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, my fingers shaking so hard that I could barely twist the knob. But just as I was about to wrench the door open, I heard it, a sound, a soft, wet movement coming from behind the wall. I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs, my entire body screaming at me to run. But something about that sound, it was like something was shifting, sliding, like whatever was behind that crack wasn't just peering through it anymore. It was moving. I swallowed hard and turned my head slightly, just enough to look over my shoulder. The eye was still there, but now there were two. Another eye had appeared just above the first one, slightly misaligned, both of them blinking at different times, both locked onto me. My entire body went rigid. My vision blurred at the edges, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I could feel something deep in my stomach, a primal fear, a knowledge that something was very, very wrong with this place. I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the hallway. The moment I was out of the apartment, the air felt different, lighter, clearer. I took in deep, shuddering breaths, my hands gripping my knees as I bent over, trying to stop myself from shaking. What the hell had I just seen? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to think rationally. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell was going on with that wall. And I knew exactly who I had to ask. My neighbor, Mr. Grayson. He had lived in this building longer than anyone else. If there was something strange about this apartment, he would know. Steeling myself, I forced my feet to move, walking down the hallway to his door. My knuckles rapped against the wood, harder than necessary. My heartbeat was still erratic, my breath still uneven. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, just as I was about to knock again, the door creaked open. Mr. Grayson stood there, his pale blue eyes staring at me, a slow, heavy breath escaping his lips. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something darker. I opened my mouth, ready to spill everything, but before I could say a word, he spoke first. "You saw them, didn't you?" My stomach dropped. The blood drained from my face. I felt my hands tremble at my sides, because the way he said it, the way he already knew, told me that this wasn't just my imagination. It wasn't just some illusion. Those eyes in the wall were real, and Mr. Grayson had seen them too. Mr. Grayson's words clung to the air like thick smoke, choking the breath from my lungs. "You saw them, didn't you?" A million thoughts collided in my head, but only one stuck. He knew. He knew what was happening inside my apartment, inside the walls. I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my ears, my mouth suddenly too dry to speak. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of us moved. Mr. Grayson's expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those pale, weary eyes, were filled with something I couldn't quite name. Resignation? Fear? I swallowed hard, forcing words past my tightening throat. What the hell is in my wall?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. Mr. Grayson let out a slow breath, then glanced over his shoulder as if checking for something or someone before stepping back. "Come inside," he said, voice low. Everything in me screamed no. Every horror movie I had ever watched told me that stepping into his apartment was a mistake, that I should turn and run and never come back. But I couldn't. I needed to know. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. Mr. Grayson's apartment was nearly identical to mine in layout, but where mine was barely furnished, his was cluttered, suffocatingly so. Piles of newspapers stacked high on every available surface, old books with yellowed pages, dusty picture frames, and an assortment of clocks, dozens of them, ticking in uneven rhythms, filling the space with an unsettling chorus. The smell of stale coffee and something older, muskier, clung to the air. He shut the door behind me, locking it with a series of heavy clicks. "Sit!" He gestured toward a worn-out armchair, its fabric frayed at the edges. I hesitated before lowering myself onto it, keeping my hands on my knees, tense, ready to bolt if I needed to. Mr. Grayson sat across from me in a creaking wooden chair, his fingers intertwined, his gaze heavy. "Tell me what you saw," he said. I hesitated, suddenly unsure of how much to say. But the image of that eye, those two eyes, flashed in my mind, sending a violent shudder down my spine. I told him everything. The strange feeling of being watched, the crack in the wall, the eye, the blinking, living eye, staring at me, the way it moved, like something shifting beneath the plaster, like it was trying to see more of me. I left nothing out. When I finished, silence stretched between us. The only sounds were the mismatched ticking of his clocks and the faint hum of the city outside. Then Mr. Grayson sighed, a long, tired sound. "I was hoping it wouldn't happen to you," he muttered, rubbing his face with a weathered hand. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked, leaning forward. His eyes met mine. "You're not the first to see them," he said, "and you won't be the last." A cold weight settled in my stomach. "You knew this would happen?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Grayson nodded slowly. I felt my hands tighten into fists. "What are they?" His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice low and heavy with something ancient, he said, "They're the ones who never left." A shiver ran through me. What the hell does that mean? Mr. Grayson shifted in his chair, his gaze distant, as if looking into a past only he could see. "This building, it's older than it looks," he said. used to be something else before it was turned into apartments. Back in the 1940s, this place was a boarding house. Run down, cheap. The kind of place where people came to disappear. My throat went dry. A lot of bad things happened here, he continued. Murders, suicides, people went missing. And the ones who did disappear, well, some of them never really left. My mind spun. Are you saying this place is haunted? Mr. Grayson let out a humorless chuckle. Ghosts would be easier. The dead don't always stay dead, kid. Sometimes they linger, and sometimes they find places to hide. I felt my skin prickle. He leaned forward, his pale blue eyes locking onto mine. They live in the walls, he said. They watch, they listen, they wait. The words sent a chill so deep into my bones that I felt like I'd never be warm again. I shook my head, trying to process what I was hearing. That's insane. That's not possible. You saw them. He cut me off. You tell me if it's impossible. I opened my mouth, but no words came out, because he was right. I had seen them, the eyes in the wall. I took a shaky breath. What do they want? Mr. Grayson hesitated. I don't know for sure, but I do know this: they choose who they reveal themselves to. Not everyone sees them. And once you do, he trailed off, his gaze darkening. A heavy silence settled over the room. Finally, I found my voice. How do I make them go away? Mr. Grayson sighed again, rubbing his temple. You don't. I felt my stomach drop. But, he continued, you can keep them from getting closer. My blood turned to ice. What do you mean, closer? He hesitated before answering. They start with the walls, watching, waiting. But if you ignore them, if you pretend they aren't there, sometimes they want more. A sickening feeling curled in my gut. How do I stop them? I asked. Mr. Grayson stood and walked to a cluttered shelf, rummaging through a pile of old books and yellowed papers. He pulled out a small tin container and handed it to me. Inside was a handful of dark, powdery substance. Salt and iron filings, he said. Old tricks, but they work. Sprinkle it along the walls, the doorways, the windows. They don't like it. I swallowed hard. That's it. He hesitated. And don't talk to them, he said quietly. No matter what they whisper, no matter what they promise. My skin crawled. I stood up, gripping the tin like a lifeline. Thanks, I muttered. Mr. Grayson nodded, his face unreadable. Be careful, kid. I turned to leave, but before I stepped out the door, he spoke again. And Jake? I stopped, looking back at him. If you ever see more than just their eyes. His voice was grave, warning. Run. His door shut behind me with a quiet finality, leaving me alone in the cold, silent hallway. I took a deep breath and stepped back into my apartment, locking the door behind me. But as I turned, my eyes landed on the wall. The crack was still there, and this time, there were 3 eyes watching me. I stood frozen in the doorway of my apartment, my breath caught in my throat. 3. There were now 3 eyes staring at me from within the crack in the wall. My heart pounded so violently that I could feel it in my throat. My skin crawled, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my body refused to move. The eyes didn't blink in unison. One would close while the others remained open, watching, observing. I clenched the tin of salt and iron so hard that the metal bit into my palm. Mr. Grayson had told me not to talk to them, not to engage. Just ignore them, pretend they weren't there. But how could I ignore this? Slowly, deliberately, I forced myself to look away. I shut the door behind me and locked it, twisting the deadbolt with shaking fingers. The feeling of being watched was unbearable, but I didn't dare acknowledge them. I would not look at the wall again. Not tonight. Moving on autopilot, I grabbed a handful of the salt and iron mixture and sprinkled it along the base of the wall, making a thick, uneven line. I did the same along the edges of my window, my door, any possible opening into my apartment. The entire time, I could feel them watching me. The air felt heavier, denser, pressing in on me from all sides. I swore I could hear something breathing coming from inside the wall. Shallow, ragged breaths, almost in sync with my own. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. Once I had covered every potential entry point, I stepped back, staring at the wall one last time. The eyes were still there, unmoving, unblinking. I swallowed the lump in my throat and turned away, forcing myself to go to bed. I didn't sleep. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I heard it. A whisper, soft, barely audible, like wind slipping through a crack in the window. Except it wasn't coming from the window. It was coming from the wall. I lay completely still in bed, my back turned to the source of the noise. My entire body was locked in place, paralyzed by fear. The whisper came again, clearer this time. A voice. Jake! I stopped breathing. They knew my name. A deep, cold dread settled in my gut. Mr. Grayson had warned me, don't talk to them. But the voice sounded so human. I clenched my fists under the covers, my nails digging into my palms. Ignore it. Pretend you don't hear it. But then, Jake, why won't you look at us? A sharp shiver ran down my spine. My fingers twitched. My body wanted to turn toward the wall to see if the eyes were still there. I squeezed my eyes shut. I would not give them the satisfaction. The whispering continued, soft, almost pleading. We see you. I pressed my hands over my ears. Go away. Go away. We can hear your heart beating. I sucked in a sharp breath. My pulse was hammering in my chest. Far too fast. Too erratic. The whispering grew fainter. Let us in, Jake. It's lonely in the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted upright in bed, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, hitting the wall. The eyes were gone. I let out a shaky breath, my entire body trembling. Had I imagined it? Was I going insane? I slowly slid out of bed, my legs weak beneath me, and crept toward the wall. The salt was still there, undisturbed. The crack was still in place, thin and jagged. But there were no eyes. I exhaled, pressing a hand against my forehead. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe the lack of sleep was messing with my mind. Shaking my head, I turned to go back to bed. That's when I heard it. A scraping sound. Low, slow, deliberate, like fingernails against wood. My blood ran cold. It was coming from inside the wall. A slow, steady scratch, scratch, scratch. Something was moving in there. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over myself. The sound did not stop. I grabbed my phone and, without thinking, opened the voice recorder. I had no idea why. Maybe some desperate need to prove to myself that this was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. I hit record and held up the phone, my breath shaky. The scratching paused. Then something tapped against the wall. 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. I clapped a hand over my mouth, stifling a gasp. Silence. And then, Jake! The voice was right behind the wall now, so close I could almost feel the breath of it against my skin. I lunged forward, grabbing the tin of salt and iron, and threw another handful against the crack. The whispering stopped. The scratching stopped. The silence stretched on. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. 1 second, 2, 3, and then a quiet, distant chuckle, like something amused, like something patient. And then, as if the whole thing had been a dream, the presence behind the wall was gone. I staggered back, shaking, clutching my phone in my hand. The recording was still going. I forced myself to stop it and hesitated before hitting play. The room filled with silence. Then, "Jake!" I dropped the phone. The whisper had been there. It was real. I had proof. But that wasn't what made my stomach churn. That wasn't what sent ice through my veins. Because in the recording, just after the whisper, there was a second voice. One that hadn't been there before, and it had whispered right next to my ear. "We're coming." I barely slept after hearing that recording. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something just behind the wall, grinning in the dark, whispering my name with breath that reeked of dust and decay. By the time the sun rose, I felt like a corpse, exhausted, hollow-eyed, drained. But I wasn't going to sit in my apartment and wait for those things to get closer. I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them. I banged on Mr. Grayson's door, harder than I meant to. The hallway felt too quiet, like the walls were listening. No answer. I knocked again. "Mr. Grayson, it's Jake." Still nothing. A cold feeling crept into my gut. He had to be home. He never left his apartment. I tried the handle. It wasn't locked. My heart pounded. Every instinct told me not to open that door, but something was wrong. Slowly, I pushed it open. The apartment was dark, the curtains drawn. A smell hit me. Stale, damp, like old paper and something else. Something faintly metallic. "Mr. Grayson?" I called. Silence. I stepped inside, heart hammering. The stacks of newspapers and books were still there. The endless ticking clocks still filling the space with uneven beats. But the chair where he always sat was empty. And then I saw it. A trail of deep scratches running across the wooden floor, leading from the chair to the center of the room. My stomach twisted. My feet moved before my brain could process what I was doing. The scratches ended at the rug. With a shaking hand, I grabbed the edge of the fabric and pulled. Beneath it, a trapdoor. My breath hitched. I hadn't seen this before. Had it always been here? Or had he hidden it? The handle was worn, almost rusted. My fingers curled around it, hesitated. And then, with a deep breath, I pulled it open. A staircase led down into absolute darkness. A smell hit me immediately, thick, damp, and wrong, like rotting wood and something sour. I stood at the edge of the hole, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air coming up from below felt cold, unnaturally so. I turned on my phone's flashlight. The beam barely cut through the gloom, but I could see the narrow steps leading downward. Something about them made my skin crawl. The way they seemed too smooth, too worn, as if many feet had walked them over the years. I swallowed hard. Then I descended. The steps creaked beneath me. The deeper I went, the colder the air became. The smell grew stronger, pressing against my throat like damp fingers. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a small, stone-walled room. My flashlight swept across it, illuminating old wooden shelves, rusted tools, and something that looked like an iron hook hanging from the ceiling. I turned and my stomach dropped. A mattress lay in the corner, filthy and sunken in the middle. Beside it, a pile of bones. Human bones. I staggered backward, choking on bile. Some of them were small. Too small. Oh God. I spun around, my breathing ragged. What the hell was this place? And then I saw something carved into the stone wall. A single deep hole, about the size of an eye socket, and beneath it, scratched into the stone. "We see you." A shiver crawled down my spine. I stepped closer, shining my light into the hole. The darkness inside seemed thicker, deeper than it should have been. And then, something inside moved. I stumbled back, barely holding in a scream. My flashlight flickered, and that's when I heard it. A slow, dragging sound. From behind me, I turned. Something was in the shadows, shifting near the bones. The air grew heavier, pressing against me, suffocating. A whisper, dozens of voices layered over each other, filled the space. "You came looking." A shape unfolded in the darkness, too long, too thin. "Now we've found you." A hand shot out from the shadows, long fingers, wrong fingers. I ran. I barely made it up the stairs before the trapdoor slammed shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my legs shaking so badly I almost collapsed. The apartment was dead silent. The clocks had stopped ticking. I swallowed hard and backed toward the door. Whatever was down there, it wasn't human, and it knew me now. As I turned to leave, my phone buzzed violently in my hand. A notification, a voicemail, from an unknown number. With shaking hands, I pressed play. A hiss of static filled my ears. Then, a single word, "Jake," and beneath it, faint, almost drowned out by the static. A sound like scratching inside the walls, like something crawling closer. I staggered back from the phone, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The voicemail had only said my name, but the sound underneath, that awful scratching noise, it was inside my apartment now. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The room looked the same. My bed, my bookshelf, my flickering lamp. But something felt different. The silence was too heavy, like the walls were pressing in, listening, waiting. I forced myself to take a step forward. The floor creaked beneath my weight. Then, tap, tap, tap. The sound came from inside the wall behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room. My stomach twisted. The crack in the wall, the one where the eyes had appeared before, was wider now, longer, splitting further open, and something inside it moved. A whisper slithered out, barely audible. "Jake, you should have stayed quiet." Couldn't breathe. My fingers fumbled for the tin of salt and iron on my desk. I grabbed a handful and hurled it at the crack. A horrible screech erupted from the wall, like nails against glass, like something furious. The entire room shook as the whisper turned into shrieking, echoing through the apartment. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, silence. I stood there, chest heaving, my hands still clenched around the tin. The crack in the wall was still there, but the movement inside it had stopped. For now, I swallowed hard. I couldn't stay here. I needed help. I barely remembered throwing some things into a backpack. My phone, my keys, the tin of salt. My hands were still shaking as I tore out of my apartment, down the hallway, and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the only place that felt safe. Mr. Grayson's apartment, or what was left of it. The door was still unlocked, but when I pushed it open, the apartment felt different. The ticking clocks, all of them, had stopped. The air was heavy with dust, and something sour hung in the air. I stepped inside, heart pounding. "Mr. Grayson?" I called, my voice hoarse. No answer. I took a slow step forward. The newspapers on the table were covered in dust, like no one had touched them in years. But that didn't make sense. I'd seen him just yesterday. Hadn't I? A shiver crawled down my spine. Something was wrong. My eyes drifted toward the floor, toward where I knew the trapdoor was. The rug was gone, and the trapdoor, wide open. My throat clenched. A cold draft rose from below, carrying the faintest scent of something rotting. I should have turned around. I should have left, but something compelled me forward. I peered down into the darkness, and then a sound, low, wet breathing, like something waiting. I clamped a hand over my mouth, barely holding in a gasp. Something was down there. I took a slow step back, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. The breathing shifted, like it had heard me move. Then a hand shot out from the darkness. I barely had time to react. The fingers were long, too many joints, stretching impossibly far. I stumbled back, kicking over a chair as I scrambled toward the door. The hand clawed at the floor, pulling. And then I saw it. The thing that had been whispering through my walls crawled out of the trapdoor, its limbs bent wrong, its skin stretched too tight. But the worst part, it had dozens of eyes embedded in its body. Blinded eyes, sealed shut with jagged, black stitches. And yet, it was looking right at me. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I fumbled it out with shaking hands. A new voicemail from Mr. Grayson. My fingers trembled as I hit play. First just static, then his voice, panicked, rasping. "Jake, listen to me. If you hear them whisper," a sharp burst of static. Then another voice, not his. He looked too long. The call cut off. My entire body felt cold. I turned, glancing back at my apartment building. The windows were dark. The walls stood silent. But I knew they were still watching me. And the cracks in the wall, they were still spreading. I stood in the street, the voicemail still ringing in my ears. The night air was cold against my skin, but inside, my blood felt boiling. I wasn't safe out here. I wasn't safe anywhere. The thing in the walls, whatever it was, wasn't finished with me. And now, after stepping into Mr. Grayson's apartment, after seeing it, I had made a mistake worse than just listening. I had looked too long, and it knew me now. I gripped my phone, staring at the screen. The voicemail had ended, but the timer was still running. 00:00, 00:01, 00:02. Like the call hadn't truly disconnected, like something was still listening. I pressed end call and shoved the phone into my pocket, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I couldn't stand out here. I needed to get away. But where the hell could I go? The motel. Yes, there was a rundown, shitty motel about a mile down the road. It wasn't far. If I could get there, get inside a different building, maybe I could buy myself time to think. Maybe I could figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I ran. The motel was worse than I remembered. The neon sign flickered weakly, buzzing in the still air. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a single car parked near the office. I pushed through the glass door, the bell above jingling loudly in the quiet. The man behind the counter barely glanced up from his newspaper. "Cash only," he grunted. I shoved a crumpled bill at him. "Whatever room's open, just give me the key." The man sighed, pulled a key from the rack, and slid it across the counter. "Room 6. I snatched it up and hurried out before he could ask me any questions. The room smelled like mildew and cheap cleaning spray. The wallpaper was peeling, and the bedspread had cigarette burns. But I didn't care. I just needed a place to breathe. I locked the door, slid the chain into place, and backed away. My legs felt like they could barely hold me up. I sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my hands over my face. What the hell was I supposed to do? Mr. Grayson had tried to warn me, but now he was gone. I thought of the thing crawling out of the trapdoor, its 2 long limbs, the stitched-up eyes embedded in its body. I shuddered. I needed to destroy it. But how do you kill something that can see you even without eyes? I clenched my fists, my breath shaky. I had salt. I had iron. But that wasn't enough. Something moved in the bathroom. A soft creak, barely audible over the hum of the motel's buzzing lights. I froze. I wasn't alone in the room. Slowly, I turned my head. The bathroom door was open just a crack. A sliver of darkness peeked through. I hadn't left it open. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple. I reached for my backpack, fingers fumbling for the tin of salt. And then, a whisper from the darkness. "You looked too long." The door slammed open. A flood of hands. Too many, impossibly many, crawling out from the darkness of the bathroom like spiders, their fingers twitching and reaching. I threw the salt. A horrible shriek split the air. The hands recoiled, writhing, twisting. The bathroom mirror shattered, sending shards flying across the room. I stumbled back, heart hammering. The hands were pulling back, retreating into the dark. But I knew this wasn't over. I grabbed my bag, my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't stay here. I had to end this. There was only one place left to go. Back to my apartment. Back to the wall. I don't remember the walk back. My mind was a blur of fear, exhaustion, and something deeper. Something dark curling inside my chest like a coiling shadow. When I reached the front of the building, I hesitated. The windows were dark. The air was too still. The cracks, they were spreading. They stretched up the sides of the building now, jagged veins of darkness against the concrete. The thing inside was breaking through, and I had to stop it. I stepped inside. The hallway was wrong, longer than before. The doors to the other apartments were missing, replaced by endless, stretching walls. The air smelled of dust and rot. And at the very end of the hallway, my apartment door stood open. I took a breath. Then I stepped inside. The crack in the wall was massive now, a gaping wound, spilling into the darkness beyond. I could feel it watching me. The stitched eyes, the whispers, the thing that had crawled out of the trapdoor. They had all been leading to this. I took out the tin of salt. My hands were shaking. I had one chance. I took a step forward. The whispering began again. "He looked too long. He belongs to us now." The crack widened. And then I saw it. A mass of bodies crawling over each other, twisted and blind. Their mouths moving in silent words. Their fingers clawing at the edges of reality itself. They were the wall. And in the center, Mr. Grayson, his face stretched, his eyes sewn shut. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I felt something pulling me forward. My body wasn't my own anymore. My limbs moved on their own, drawn toward the darkness. No, I fought against it. I reached into my bag, grabbed the iron knife, and plunged it into the crack. The entire room screamed. The walls shuddered. The bodies writhed, pulling away, retreating. The whispers turned into shrieks, then wails, then silence. I gasped for breath, my body shaking. The crack in the wall, it was closing. The thing inside was being pulled back, vanishing into the void. And then, the apartment was just an apartment again. The walls were whole. The whispers were gone. I stood there, panting, my hands slick with sweat. It was over. At least, that's what I thought, until I turned and saw the mirror across the room, saw my own reflection, and realized the eyes staring back at me weren't mine. And so, the story comes to an end. The night is still. The world outside is quiet, and you are safe. Maybe it was just a story, just words drifting through the air, fading into the dark. Or maybe it was something more, a whisper of something unseen, a reminder that even in silence, something might be listening. But not tonight. Tonight you can close your eyes, let your breath slow, let your body sink into comfort. The walls around you are just walls, nothing more. Sleep well, and if you dream, may your dreams be kind.